Hello, everyone. Welcome to day one of poetry here. I hope you all have the poetry packet handed out. We're going to be looking at a lot of these poems throughout the unit, and we're going to get started with the Romantics, the Romantic era of poetry. You'll see why in a little bit. Call it infinite yearning here. Basically, looking at a lot of British poets from 1780 to about 1830. So what do I mean by romantic here? What do we mean when we talk about the romantic poets? Well, there's two definitions for romantic. The first one I think that usually comes to our mind is the first one here, when it's conducive to or characterized by the expression of love, right? The definition when it comes to Valentine's Day, right? Talking about a romantic candlelit dinner. And that's all it's great version of the definition, but that's actually not the one we're referring to when we talk about the Romantic era or Romantic literature. This is actually kind of a callback to Arthurian romance, which is sort of a romanticized version of the Knights of the Round Table of medieval knights, right? And so this is more of the second definition, right? When something is characterized by or suggestive of an idealized view of reality, right? When we talk about idealizing something, we are romanticizing it, right? Having a romantic attitude toward the past, or talking about a decade, right? We romanticize that decade, maybe in the way we portray it currently. So that's actually the form of the word romantic we mean, or that we're referring to when we are talking about romantic literature or romantic poetry specifically. Now, I think there's four really great terms to use and to understand poetry of this era, but also to use in your own essays on poetry that isn't just about or isn't just romantic era poetry, but poetry that maybe talks about similar topics. The first one is sublime. When we talk about the sublime, this is talking about something, like we're feeling of such excellence or grandeur or power or beauty, and it's so amazing that it inspires great admiration or awe. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but I've heard that when you go to the Grand Canyon, especially when the sun is rising, that you are just, you're silent because you're in awe of its beauty. So that is the feeling of the sublime. If you're up in the mountains at night, you have a clear view of all the stars in the sky. You might feel the sublime. You're like, oh my gosh, the universe is so expansive. It's so amazing, and I'm just a small speck here, right? The power of the universe. Maybe the same way when you see lightning in the sky. So sublime really connects to nature most of the time, right? When you're just in such awe of the natural world, we talk about that as feeling the sublime. Nostalgia is another great term to use and to understand and be able to note it in poetry when we find it. And that's a sentimental longing or yearning or a wistful affection for the past. Now, this can be in your own personal life. Maybe you're nostalgic for when you were a child, right? And we might see a poet talk about that, like, oh my gosh, everything was so much greater when I was 10 years old, running around in the forest and not without a care in the world. And I didn't have to deal with all the troubles I have now. We're very nostalgic for that. We also use nostalgia just as a society, right? We might say like, oh, we're so nostalgic for this past time period, for that one decade, because in our mind, right, we're romanticizing it, right? We thought it was so great. Now, usually when you're being nostalgic for the past, you're neglecting or not remembering all the difficulties you had or all the problems of that time period. But that's the whole point of nostalgia. When we feel nostalgic for that time period. Now, idealism, a little more straightforward, right? When we are idealistic or looking at idealism, that's thought based off of imagination or ideals, even if it's unrealistic, right? It's very much contrasted with realism. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So when we see literature that's more idealistic, then we're not as interested in like the nitty gritty details of realistic society and whatnot. It's like, no, we want to be more imaginative. So that's kind of idealism there. And there's a connection between that and this final term, which is transcendentalism. I know some 11th grade teachers talk about transcendentalism in American literature. And this is a philosophy that emphasizes the importance of the spiritual and transcendental over the material and the empirical. the idea of, right, of like, hey, how do we transcend the fundamentals of this world and again have some type of sublime experience, have some experience or understanding of the world. Again, that's on another like other plane of existence, right? Rather than looking at data and figuring out, how this tree grows exactly. Instead, it's like, hey, how do we have a transcendental experience with this tree or with this forest? Again, it's a little more esoteric. It's like you're reaching some ethereal plane of some sort. But it's a good term to understand, to be able to note when you see it in literature. Now, I think also it really helps to understand the Romantic era by understanding the era that basically kind of came before it. And that's highlighting the Age of Reason or Enlightenment. Usually kind of seeing is that big era that occurs from around 1660 to about 1800 or the late 1700s at least. And again, this is kind of putting these time periods into neat little boxes, which is problematic, but I'm going to kind of do it for the sake of this class right now. But you have to remember, like especially in Britain, we're looking at a lot of British writers here. A lot of writers during this time period are really interested in society, the proper roles of government. How do you deal with the realities of a complex society in the world? And it makes sense why people were writing about this, because the 1600s were just full of wars, especially between Catholics and Protestants and fighting. And they realized, like, oh my gosh, like this is not a way to run a country or to just live in Europe or in Britain, right? And so in this time period, a lot of writing was focused with manners, morals, rational thinking, right? It makes sense why by the end of this era we get the Declaration of Independence, for example, a lot of, and we see revolutions and a lot of social change, right? Because that's what people were really considering. Now, I would say that the Romantic writers look back at this literature and they're like, so it's kind of lacks emotion, kind of disconnected from their passions, right? Maybe it's important writing to do, important topics to address. But again, these Romantic writers coming in the early 1800s are like, we want to have a little backlash against that time period. And you really see this also in the visual arts. Art of the Age of Reasoning is a lot more straightforward, still probably very good and profound, but it's a lot more focused on capturing society, right? Here's someone sitting at a desk. Here's the girl with the pearl earring. Here is a hall with a bunch of people in it. It's like, yeah, what does society look like? Again, people might look back on this in the Romantic era or even today and be like, that's good, but lacks emotion. So the Romantic age comes in, and they really want to have a more daring, individual, imaginative approach to literature and also to life. Instead of focusing so much on society and manners, they want to focus on like the individual, right? And so the poets of this time period are really focused on returning to nature in a sense, right? What's it like when you as an individual walk through the natural world and experience the sublime? And because of that, there's a desire to return to maybe more of a pastoral life, right? There's a romanticizing of that life. And there's a big backlash also against what they would describe as like the sins of industrialism, right? Everything that they're seeing with the world, and the harming of the natural world. And Romantic writers, we would say, are like really trying to transcend those hard facts about society, that really captivated the Enlightenment. They're trying to transcend that and be like, hey, let's get a glimpse of an ideal world, even if that's unrealistic. And that's why, they're often, the writers of this time period are also called transcendentalists. And the writers in America during this time period, Emerson and Thoreau, are writing about the same topics. They're just doing it in essay format. So again, I don't know why Americans are a little less poetic than the British here, but that is that's going on at the exact same time. And sure enough, you see that in the visual arts as well of kind of the Romantic era. And in some of the paintings, you got George Washington. Well, did he really stand exactly like this while crossing the river, to fight? Unlikely, right? Same thing here, and like revolutionary style arts. Is this really what would have been going on? It doesn't seem very realistic, but that's the point, right? Kind of having something that's more imaginative, having art that really kind of taps more into emotions rather than realism. Again, maybe both forms of literature, both forms are good. They're just different. So a lot of the poets of this time period we'll see are mostly, a lot of young men. We'll look at a couple of women who were writers, but society is still very prejudice against women and also class. People of lower classes, as we'll see, it's really hard for them to get published, sadly, in this world or in this time period. But that a lot of these writers are focusing on these topics. And that brings me to the first poet we'll take a look at here, William Wordsworth, very much kind of seen as the pioneer of the Romantic literary movement. You can't really talk about Romanticism or Romantic poetry without Wordsworth in it. And he's sure enough, he's from a higher class, but he's really interested in nature. He's really interested in nostalgia and a lot of these topics that we see that the Romantics are interested in. So what I'm going to have us do is take out our poetry packets. We're going to look at that poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, kind of a classic, maybe not as complex as some of the later ones, but it's a good one to start with because I know people approach the poetry unit really stressed out, and that's the part of the AP exam that they stress out about because it's different, right? We saw this a little bit with the Shakespeare unit. It's a little bit harder to figure out what is being said. But we'll use this poem today to at least jump into it and for some practice. So because of that, do not stress out about literary devices at all. Let's not consider literary devices or structure. Let's simply figure out what is going on in terms of the content of the poem. Now, something you're going to see a lot in this unit is this information. When we read a poem, I often say you want to read it twice. And in your first read, what you want to do is figure out these three key concepts here, these three main topics. The first thing is, okay, what's the setting, circumstance, or situation within the poem? Sometimes it's very built, the whole poem is dependent on the setting, right? Where are they? Are they in a forest? Are they by the ocean? The circumstance, have they just experienced tragedy? Are they extremely happy because of something, or is there a very like they're within a situation that's going on in the poem, like as the poem is as they're writing the poem, they are reading a book or they are rowing a boat. What is it that's going on? We want to be able to figure out what that is, right? Whatever is going on. Now, second part is speaker and audience. Sometimes this is really straightforward. Most of the time, the speaker is just like, oh, it's just the poet speaking. But other times, the speaker might be a very specific character, might be someone within the poem, or something, a person who is not the poet. So let's try to figure that out. Also, is there an intended audience? Again, most of the time, maybe 70% of the time, the audience is just, the person reading the poem. Sometimes it's very specific. It's intended for a person or someone connected to the speaker. So let's figure that out as well. Lastly, when you finish the poem, what's the purpose or message of the poem, right? What's kind of like the thematic purpose, right? What are they getting at here? Now, as I said, let's think about this in context of what we know about the Romantics so far. How does this poem reflect the ideals and values of the 19th century Romantics, kind of all the topics we just looked at? So what I'm going to have us do is take about 8 to 10 minutes here to just read through the poem, mark it up, just look for these three things. Again, don't worry about literary devices. Just see what you can kind of uncover about this poem in terms of its content, and then we'll come back to it and we'll break it down. So let's take about 8 to 10 minutes here just to read through it.